The wind howled through the skeletal frame of the farmhouse, a lament for what was lost. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light, piercing the gloom of the attic, illuminating the decay like glittering tears. Alara pulled the threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, the damp chill seeping into her bones despite the layers of patched fabric. Hunger was a dull ache, a constant companion since the fever took her parents, leaving her alone in this crumbling shell of a life. Below, the house groaned with each gust, the sounds echoing the emptiness within her. They said she was foolish to stay, that a woman alone had no place scratching out an existence on this barren land. The nearest town was days away, a place of pitying stares and whispers she couldn't bear. Despair was a heavy cloak, threatening to smother the last embers of her will. She needed firewood, anything to stave off the cold bite of the coming night. Rummaging through a rotting trunk tucked deep in a dusty corner, her fingers brushed against something stiff and crackly beneath moth-eaten blankets. It was an envelope, brittle with age, addressed in a spidery hand to her mother. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded and refolded until the creases were worn white. The ink was faded, the language formal, almost foreign. She squinted, holding it close to the weak light. It spoke of a debt, a promise made long ago, tied to a piece of land, and a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne. The name meant nothing to her. The letter mentioned a ranch, nestled near the foothills, a place called the Broken Spur. It implied a standing offer of assistance, a place if ever it was needed. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold. Could it be true? A lifeline from the past? Or a cruel, meaningless relic? The letter offered no guarantees, only a faint, almost imperceptible thread of possibility. Yet, in the face of utter desolation, that thread felt stronger than iron cable. The thought of leaving this house, the only home she'd ever known, filled her with terror. The world outside was vast, unforgiving, full of unknown dangers. But staying meant certain, slow decay, like the house around her. It was a choice between a terrifying unknown and a familiar, lingering death. She refolded the letter carefully, tucking it inside her dress. It was little more than ink on paper, a ghost of a promise. But it was something, a direction, however faint. It ignited a flicker of resolve in the cold darkness of her soul. The ranch, the Broken Spur. It was a name she clung to, a distant beacon in the overwhelming night. The journey would be hard, impossibly hard for a woman alone. But the alternative was simply to cease existing. She gathered an armful of decaying wood. The crackle of the dry wrought a morbid comfort. Tonight, she would build a fire, eat the last of the dried beans, and prepare. Prepare for a desperate gamble against the overwhelming odds stacked against her. The Broken Spur, Elias Thorne. Names that held the fragile weight of her future. The world outside the farmhouse was even harsher than she had imagined. Each mile was a struggle against the wind, the dust, the sheer indifference of the landscape. The sun beat down relentlessly during the day, only to be replaced by a biting cold once it set. Her meager supplies dwindled quickly. Fear was a constant companion, a knot in her stomach tightening with every rustle in the underbrush, every distant coyote howl. She walked until her boots wore thin, until her feet were a mass of blisters, until her legs ached with an exhaustion that felt permanent. The letter, clutched beneath her clothes, became a talisman, a reason to put one foot in front of the other when her body screamed for rest. Days blurred into a painful rhythm of walking, shivering through the nights, and forcing down tasteless scraps. She saw few signs of civilization, only vast, empty plains and distant, unyielding mountains. Doubt gnawed at her. What if the ranch was gone? What if Elias Thorne was dead, or worse, cruel? The letter was decades old, its promise likely long forgotten or invalidated. But the desperation that drove her from the farmhouse was a relentless whip. She had no other option. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the land began to change. Rolling hills appeared, dotted with scrub brush and hardy trees. And then, in a valley below, she saw it. A cluster of buildings, small but sturdy, nestled against the foothills. Smoke curled from a chimney. It was the broken spur. Relief washed over her, so potent it nearly brought her to her knees. But it was quickly followed by a fresh wave of apprehension. What now? As she approached, a figure emerged from the main cabin. Tall, broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the setting sun. He moved with a quiet strength that was both intimidating and, she admitted with a jolt, strangely reassuring after days of utter solitude. This must be Elias Thorne. He stopped, watching her approach, his posture wary. He didn't wave or call out, simply stood and observed. His silence was unnerving. She swallowed, her throat dry, her voice barely a whisper when she finally stood before him. "Mr. Thorne? I have a letter," she fumbled for the creased paper, her hands shaking. He took it, his large fingers surprisingly gentle. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of worn leather, deep-set and unreadable. He unfolded the letter slowly, his gaze scanning the faded ink. As he read, his expression remained impassive, giving away nothing of his thoughts. The silence stretched, heavy with her anticipation and his stoic examination. When he finished, he refolded it carefully and handed it back. "My mother's hand," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough-edged like river stone. "And your mother's name, Sarah." He looked at her again, a long, measured look that seemed to see through her ragged clothes and weary facade, straight into the core of her being. "The letter is old," he stated, not unkindly. "Decades." He didn't offer immediate comfort, didn't sweep her into a warm cabin or offer lavish food. Instead, his response was practical, understated. "You look like you could use a meal and a roof," he said finally, turning towards the cabin. It wasn't a welcome, not exactly, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was an acknowledgement of her basic needs, devoid of pity. She followed him into the cabin, which was sparsely furnished but clean and orderly. A fire crackled in the hearth, radiating a warmth that made her shiver with gratitude. He motioned to a stool by the rough-hewn table. "Sit," he busied himself at the stove, the smells of coffee and cooking beans filling the air. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry into how she came to be alone, or why she had the letter now. His silence was a space she could simply exist in without the need for explanations or apologies. She ate slowly, savoring every bite of the simple, hearty food. Elias sat across from her, eating in silence, his gaze occasionally resting on her with that same unreadable intensity. There was a quiet strength about him, a self-sufficiency that spoke of years spent alone in this unforgiving land. He was weathered, his face lined, but his movements were efficient and purposeful. After the meal, he showed her to a small, separate shed near the cabin, furnished with a cot, a thin mattress, and a blanket. "It's not much," he said, "but it's dry." It felt like a palace. She fell asleep almost instantly, the exhaustion of the journey finally claiming her. The next few days were a tentative dance of unspoken understanding. He gave her small tasks, helping with the horses, mending fences, working in the small garden plot. The work was hard, but it was purposeful, and the physical labor was a welcome distraction from her anxieties. He observed her constantly, his eyes missing nothing, but he rarely spoke more than a few necessary words. She, in turn, watched him. She saw the dedication he put into the ranch, the way he cared for his animals, the quiet determination with which he faced the challenges of his isolated life. He was solitary, perhaps lonely, but not broken. There was a resilience in him that resonated with the flicker she desperately tried to keep alive within herself. She learned about the ranch's precarious situation through overheard conversations with a hired hand who visited occasionally, and through Elias's weary sighs at the end of long days. There were boundary disputes with a larger, more powerful rancher to the south, threats whispered about water rights and grazing land. The broken spur was struggling, threatened on multiple fronts. It wasn't the safe haven the old letter might have implied, but a place fighting for its very existence. Yet Elias stayed stubbornly clinging to his land. One evening, a storm rolled in, fierce and sudden. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the cabin walls, threatening to tear the roof off. Elias worked tirelessly, securing loose shutters, checking on the livestock. Alara helped as best she could, holding lanterns, fetching tools. In the dim light of the storm, working side by side, a different kind of silence settled between them, one of shared purpose, of mutual reliance. For a few hours, they weren't strangers bound by an old letter, but two people facing down a common foe in the raging elements. When the worst of the storm passed, they sat by the fire, the only sound the crackling flames and the distant rumble of thunder. The air was thick with the aftermath of the storm, a quiet tension lingering after the fury had passed. Elias banked the fire, his movements slow with exhaustion. He looked at Alara, his gaze softer than she had ever seen it. "You didn't flinch," he said, his voice low. "Most folks would have been huddled under the table." Alara shrugged, a small gesture. "Seen worse?" she murmured, thinking of the slow rot of her old life, the gnawing fear that had been her constant companion. It wasn't entirely true. The storm had been terrifying, but the fear of nature felt cleaner, simpler, than the fear of human cruelty or quiet decay. His lips curved slightly, a ghost of a smile that transformed his face. "Resilient," he observed, a note of quiet respect in his tone. It was the most he had praised her. In the weeks that followed, the tentative bond forged in shared labor and weathered storms deepened. The external threats didn't abate. The neighbor to the south, a man named Hemlock, escalated his intimidation tactics. Fences were cut, cattle were driven off. Elias faced it with grim determination, but Alara saw the strain on him. The worry etched deeper into his face. She started to help more proactively, noticing things he might miss, using her quick mind to spot inconsistencies or potential problems. She wasn't strong like him, but she was observant, resourceful. She found ways to patch the cut fences with limited supplies, devised methods to keep the garden productive despite the harsh soil, organized his sparse larder. Small things, perhaps, but vital in their isolated existence. One afternoon, they found a section of fence not just cut, but trampled, a clear message of aggression. Elias stood staring at it, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. For the first time, she saw a flicker of despair in his eyes. "He wants to break me," he said, his voice flat. "And he's close instinctively." She stepped forward, placing a hand tentatively on his arm. "He hasn't broken you yet," she said softly. "And he won't. Not if we don't let him." He looked at her, surprised by her defiance, by the quiet strength in her voice. The touch lingered, brief but significant. It wasn't born of romance, but of shared struggle, a mutual recognition of the fight required simply to endure. He didn't pull away. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, his palm rough against her skin. It was a moment of profound connection, wordless and deep. The letter had brought her here seeking refuge, but she had found something unexpected, a shared battle, and a quiet partnership forming in the crucible of hardship. The stakes were no longer just her survival, but the survival of the broken spur, and of the man who had, in his own quiet way, offered her a chance. The storm was coming. She knew, not just of the elements, but of human greed and malice. And they would face it together. The confrontation was inevitable. Hemlock and two of his men rode up to the ranch one sweltering afternoon, dust billowing behind them. They reeked of whiskey and arrogance. Elias met them in the yard, his stance defensive but controlled. Alara stood a little behind him, by the cabin steps, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. She would not hide. Hemlock dismounted, a sneer on his face. "Thorn," he spat. "Time you gave up this little patch. It's mine. Always was, by rights." Elias didn't budge. "My mother built this place. It's hers, then mine. Old paper don't mean nothin' out here." Hemlock scoffed, gesturing dismissively. "Might makes right." His eyes flicked towards Alara, a calculating, unpleasant look. "Didn't know you kept company, Thorn. A woman, livin' out here? Seems irregular." The implication hung heavy in the air. The societal judgment she had fled finding her even here. Elias's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. She's under my protection, Hemlock. You got business with me. Keep her out of it. The tension was a palpable thing. Stretched wire taut. Hemlock laughed. A harsh, grating sound. Protection? You can barely protect yourself, Thorn. And your little ranch is failin'. He took a step forward, reaching for his gun belt. It was a carefully orchestrated intimidation, meant to provoke or terrify. But Alara remembered the letter, the faint hope it represented, the quiet strength she had witnessed in Elias, and the hard-won resilience she had found within herself. Stepping forward, she spoke, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This land belongs to Elias Thorn," she stated, her gaze unwavering. "And you have no right to threaten him or trespass here." All three men turned to look at her, surprised by her intervention. Hemlock's sneer faltered for a moment, replaced by annoyance. "Get back inside, woman. This ain't your affair. It is my affair," she countered, drawing strength from Elias's steady presence beside her. As much as anyone's who believes in what is right, it wasn't a dramatic standoff with guns blazing, but a tense battle of wills, of presence and quiet courage against bluster and threat. Hemlock hesitated, perhaps unnerved by her unexpected defiance, by the unexpected unity between them. He hadn't anticipated her standing with Elias, speaking up. His men shifted uneasily. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken threats and possibilities. Finally, with a frustrated growl, Hemlock backed down slightly. "This ain't over, Thorn," he snarled, remounting his horse. "You'll get what's comin' to you." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and the lingering stench of malice. Elias let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something akin to awe. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Didn't have to stand there." "Yes, I did," she replied simply. The threat remained, but they had faced it together, side by side. In that moment, the old, forgotten letter felt less like a relic of the past and more like the foundation of a future they would build, piece by painstaking piece, on this hard, beautiful land. The ranch was still precarious, the threats real, but Alara was no longer a desolate figure seeking refuge. She was a woman who had found her feet on solid ground, standing beside a man who saw her strength, not just her vulnerability. The letter had led her here, into hardship, but also into a partnership forged in resilience and quiet dignity.